My name is Jack, and I want to tell you a story that happened to me a few years ago. It was summer, and I was driving through a small town deep in America. I worked as a truck driver and often took night routes to avoid traffic. That night, I stopped at an old gas station near the highway to grab some coffee and rest a bit. The gas station was strange. A tiny store with dirty windows, only a few dim bulbs inside. I walked in and immediately smelled dampness and stale coffee. Behind the counter sat a man in his 60s, skinny, with an empty gaze. He didn't greet me, just watched as I grabbed a bottle of water and a cup of coffee from the machine. When I paid, he suddenly said, "You better not drive down that road tonight." His voice was low and cracked. I asked what he meant, but he only smiled, showing yellow teeth, and said nothing else. I ignored it and drove on. The road was empty, just forests on both sides and occasional animal warning signs. After about half an hour, I saw flickering red lights ahead. It looked like an accident. I stopped, got out of the truck, and walked closer. In the middle of the road stood an old pickup, its door wide open. No one inside. On the asphalt were scratches, as if someone had dragged something heavy toward the forest. Then I heard it, a muffled groan. It came from the darkness between the trees. I called out, "Hey, is someone there? Do you need help?" But the only reply was footsteps, slow, heavy, approaching me. My stomach dropped. I stepped back toward the truck, and then a figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, impossibly thin, its face hidden in the shadows. It stopped right in the middle of the road, staring at me. I jumped into the cab, started the engine, and hit the gas. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure still standing there, not moving, but I could feel its gaze piercing me through the night. When I reached the next town, I told the police. They just exchanged looks and said, "You're not the first one to see something like that on that stretch of road." Since then, I never drive there at night again.
My name is Sarah, and I want to tell you what happened to me a few years ago. It was autumn when I went on a trip to the lake with my friends. We rented a small wooden cabin in the forest, a few miles from the nearest town. At first, everything was perfect. Barbecues, walks, late-night talks by the fire. But the first night, something strange happened. I woke up to a quiet tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was the wind or a branch, but the sound was too clear, too rhythmic, like someone tapping a finger on the glass. I got up and looked. Outside was darkness, only the moon's reflection on the water. Nobody there. The next day, I told my friends, but they just laughed it off, saying I was imagining things. That evening, we were sitting by the fire when suddenly we heard a child's laughter coming from the forest. It was high-pitched and strange, like recorded on an old tape. We went to check, but of course, no one was there. That same night, I woke up again, this time to footsteps on the porch. Someone was slowly walking back and forth along the cabin. I froze, barely breathing. Then the doorknob quietly turned, but the door was locked. The next morning, we found footprints on the ground, small, bare, like a child's. But when we asked in town, they told us no one lived nearby, and certainly no children. We decided to leave early, but before we left, I looked once more at the lake. On the opposite shore stood a small figure. It didn't move, just stared at us. Since then, I can't sleep peacefully near water. I still hear that laughter at night echoing in my mind.
Hi, my name is Ethan. What I'm about to tell you happened last fall, and to be honest, I still can't get it out of my head. I've always been an experienced hiker. Since childhood, my father taught me how to hike, navigate the terrain, build a fire, and respect the wilderness. The forests of Oregon were my second home. I knew their trails, their sounds, their smells. I was never afraid of being alone among the giant trees. On the contrary, I found peace in it. But what happened during my last 3-day hike changed my perspective forever. It stripped me of that sense of comfort and made me realize that there are corners of the world, even in my own familiar forests, where people shouldn't go. It all started perfectly. The weather was beautiful for mid-October, sunny but not too hot. The air was crisp and clean, and a carpet of gold and crimson leaves rustled under my feet. I left my car in the parking lot at the head of a well-known trail, threw my backpack over my shoulders, and headed deep into the Mount Hood National Forest. My plan was simple: hike about 20 miles to a remote lake, camp there for the night, and then return via a different, less traveled route. The first day passed without incident. I enjoyed the silence, broken only by the chirping of birds and the snap of twigs under my boots. There wasn't another soul around. That's exactly what I was looking for: an escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. On the second day, the weather started to turn. The sky became overcast with gray clouds, and a light breeze turned into a piercing cold wind. Around noon, it started to rain. At first a drizzle, then it turned into a real downpour. The trail I was on became a muddy mess. My waterproof jacket helped, but my feet got soaked quickly. I kept going, hoping the rain would soon subside, but it didn't. To make matters worse, a fog began to roll in over the forest. A thick, milky white fog that swallowed everything more than an arm's length away. I had hiked these parts dozens of times, but I had never seen a fog this dense. Very soon, I realized I was lost. Familiar landmarks disappeared into the mist. My compass showed that I was moving west as planned, but the trail itself had vanished. I found myself in the middle of thick undergrowth, pushing through wet branches that whipped at my face. Panic began to set in. The cold was chilling me to the bone, and darkness was approaching much earlier due to the thick clouds. I knew that spending the night in these conditions, wet and without shelter, was dangerous. Just as despair was about to take over, I saw something ahead. A faint yellowish light was piercing through the fog. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Who could be out here, so far from any known trails? But the light didn't disappear. It was weak, but steady. A glimmer of hope sparked in my chest. I walked toward that light, despite my exhaustion and the cold. After about 10 minutes, I emerged into a small clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. Before me stood a small wooden cabin, and the light I had seen was coming from its window. It was unbelievable. The cabin wasn't marked on any map, and I had never heard of it. It looked old but surprisingly well maintained. The wooden walls were dark with age and moisture, but not rotten. A faint wisp of smoke was rising from the chimney. Caution battled with my desire for shelter. Something about the scene felt wrong. The atmosphere around the cabin was oppressive. The forest here seemed dead. Not a sound, not a rustle. Even the rain seemed to fall more quietly. But I had no choice. I walked up to the door. Near the entrance, on a wooden plank, was a strange list, handwritten in a neat calligraphic script. They were rules. Do not knock. The door is always open. Do not speak unless spoken to first. Take only what is offered. Do not look in mirrors after sunset. Leave something in return when you depart. It was bizarre and creepy. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my freezing body was begging for warmth. Following the first rule, I carefully pushed the door handle. The door swung open silently. Inside, it was warm and cozy. A fire crackled in the fireplace. The single room was simple but clean. An old armchair stood by the fire. The table and 2 chairs were in the middle of the room, and in the corner was a bed with a plaid blanket. And there was a man, an old gray-haired man sitting in the armchair with his back to me, seemingly unaware of my presence. I froze on the threshold, not knowing what to do. "Excuse me?" I started, but immediately fell silent, remembering the second rule. I just stood there, wet and cold, waiting. What felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute, passed before the old man slowly turned his head. He had a wrinkled face and pale, almost colorless eyes. He looked at me silently, then nodded toward the chair by the table. I took it as an invitation and sat down, dropping my pack to the floor. The old man stood up just as silently, walked to a small stove in the corner, poured a hot liquid into a clay mug, and placed it in front of me. It was herbal tea. Its aroma was rich and a little strange, but the drink was hot, and I began to sip it gratefully. The old man sat back down in his armchair and stared into the fire again. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the crackling of the logs and my sips. I wanted to thank him, to ask where I was, but rule number 2 was firmly stuck in my head. Hours passed. The old man didn't say a word. He just sat there, as still as a statue. When it finally got dark outside, he silently stood up, pointed to the bed, then took an old blanket from the floor and settled into the armchair by the fire. I understood that he was offering me a place to sleep. I was so exhausted that, despite the strangeness of the situation, I accepted. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was like a quiet whisper coming from outside. It was monotonous, rhythmic. I propped myself up on my elbows and listened. The whispering didn't stop. I looked at the old man. He was asleep in his chair, seemingly hearing nothing. Curiosity overcame my fear. I crept to the window and carefully peeked outside. The fog had cleared a little bit, and moonlight was breaking through the clouds. In the clearing, in front of the cabin, stood figures. There were 5 or 6 of them. They were tall and thin, and they moved slowly, almost unnaturally, in a circle. Their faces were indistinguishable in the dark, but I could feel them. They were watching the cabin, and it was from them that the eerie, monotonous whispering was coming. Cold terror gripped me. What was this place? Who were these things? I recoiled from the window, my heart pounding. I looked at the owner of the cabin. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open and staring right at me. In their depths, I saw no fear or surprise, only a boundless weariness. He gave a slight shake of his head, as if warning me. I understood. He knew about them. Perhaps this cabin and these rules existed to protect against them. I went back to bed, but of course I couldn't sleep anymore. I lay there listening to the whispering outside the walls, which continued until dawn. As soon as the first rays of sunlight broke through the fog, the whispering stopped. I didn't wait. As soon as it was light, I grabbed my backpack. The old man was already standing by the table. On it lay a piece of bread and an apple. Adhering to rule number 3, I took them. Now it was time for rule number 5. Leave something in return when you depart. I didn't have anything valuable. I rummaged in my pack and took out my best folding knife, a gift from my father. It was all I could offer. I placed it on the table. The old man nodded. For the first time, he spoke. His voice was quiet and hoarse. as if it hadn't been used in a long time. Go east. Don't stop, and don't look back. I left the cabin and, without looking back, walked quickly to the east. The forest no longer seemed calm and inviting. Now every shadow, every sound made me flinch. I walked for hours until I finally came out to a familiar trail. I'd never been so happy to see a simple, beaten path in my life. Since then, I don't go hiking alone anymore. Sometimes at night, when the wind blows outside my window, I think I can hear that monotonous whispering again. I don't know what it was, a dream, a hallucination from exhaustion, or something real. But I remember the old man's eyes. He wasn't a ghost or a monster. He was a prisoner. And I still don't know what scares me more. Those figures in the fog, or the thought of what would happen if someone, one day, breaks one of those rules.